I'm Bryan Liles from DigitalOcean, and I know that we are at a data conference, but you can't actually have data without ops. So I want to talk about a subject that's a little bit lower on the stack, but it's still very important to providing a good data platform. So the title of this is Tiptoeing into the Continuous Delivery, and the first thing we're going to talk about is a ladder. And why do you have a ladder in a data talk? Well, because you need to climb this ladder to get to success. And the first part of this ladder we're going to talk about just a little bit is continuous integration, and then we'll talk about continuous development, and then logging, and then we'll talk about metrics, and then we'll talk about error handling. So let's start with continuous deployment. What? What do you mean, continuous deployment? Do you not have continuous delivery in your infrastructure stack? Do you not have the ability to deploy software at any time? Well, let's look at this. So let's first of all, let's talk about some do's and don'ts, but I want to start with don'ts first. Don't deploy get master. And the reason why you shouldn't deploy get master is because master is always relative. It doesn't actually point to anything. It points to the latest at a current time. So instead of deploying that, we'll talk about something else. Also, don't deploy tarballs, because what's a tarball? I don't know either. A tarball is a whole bunch of random things. And I know that there's a lot of Java people here, and I know that you generate a lot of ears, wars, and jars, but don't just deploy an ear, war, or jar. There's a better way of doing this. So what do we do instead? Well, deploy artifacts. What's an artifact? I'll talk about that in a second. What's an artifact? Well, an artifact is a get ref. So instead of deploying master, why don't you deploy the SHA-1 that master points to at a particular time? In this case, you can make sure that deploy is always repeatable. We're in the age of containers now, so deploy Docker images. But don't deploy a Docker image with the tag of latest. Make sure you're versioning your Docker images correctly and only deploying that image. Or, find out what I'm saying and fit it to your stack. You might have to deploy a tarball or a var or a jar, but make sure that they can be identified and recreated later. So where are you going to deploy to? Well, where do you deploy your apps? Well, you know what? We deal with computers, and unfortunately, there are a lot of options. I'm going to only advocate deploying at DigitalOcean because that's where we are right now. That's who we're talking about. That's what I do. But I do want to talk about you can deploy almost anywhere, but realize that when you're deploying, understand your stack, understand where you're deploying to. So now let's talk about deployment strategies. So when we talk about deployment strategies, we talk about starting with the server. But you know what, in the age, like I said, we're in the age of Docker, so you're also thinking about containers. So you might be deploying to Kubernetes, or you might not. So you might be deploying to Mesos, or you might be deploying to Nomad, or you might have another stack like Canonical's Juju. But remember this, whatever you're deploying to, you're going to make sure that you're deploying something that you can identify by name or ID, and you're going to make sure that you at least have the ability to scale it in any way that you need to without a lot of work, which is why I always suggest Kubernetes for lower ops tasks. But also remember that we're only going to start off as simple as possible in every case. So how do we deploy? Well, how do we deploy? Well, at a time in our past, deployment scripts always consisted of taking the current piece of software, putting it in some kind of archive, and copying it to somewhere. You know what? In 2016, we're not doing that anymore. First of all, we're not deploying by hand. All deploys should be automated by some kind of script or some kind of process. But think about that. When you think about your automation, what have you automated? Have you automated the creation of your deployment artifacts? Have you automated the piece of putting it on a server? And have you automated what happens whenever a deploy fails? Something to think about. And anytime, and I know everyone watching this talk is like, well, I have a great deployment situation here. I'm going to say I don't believe you. And not because I think that you're going to fail, it's just because I want you to rethink about your deployment strategies before moving forward again. So, a deployment isn't necessarily just moving apps from artifact repository server, your local desktop, some other server, S3, if you happen to be using that, to a server. It's actually more than that. So think about this. When you deploy, who knows? If a deploy happens and no one listens, does the deploy actually really happen? Think about that. So what we do with our notifications at DigitalOcean is that whenever there's a deploy that happens to production in a lot of our stacks, we actually do have a channel that gets notified. And then do you monitor your deploys? How do you determine if your deploy happens successfully? That's a question that I want you to think about. I can give you a couple solutions right now. So if you're going to monitor your deploy, you know how long they're going to happen. So if they take too long, that's a problem. If there's an exception while copying artifacts around, that's an exception. So what about all the way automating your deploys? So I'll show you something that we do at DigitalOcean. I've actually created this slide. It's a picture of our Slack, but I had to make sure that I redacted everything that was pretty sensitive. But I'm going to go pretty rogue here, and this is actually from a little bit ago, and it's our deploy Slack. What we have here is the ability to deploy random websites to production, and I'm going to point. And so right here, like we're deploying our developer site, developers.digitalocean, to staging, and then someone verified it just a little bit long. They verified it in about 18 minutes, and then we're deploying it to production. Notice that our deploys are happening in public. Private deploys on some administrators' box are never helpful. So how do we deploy? Well, think about this. Sorry, that's a yellow slide. These slides were originally black. So how do we do canary builds? Well, when you're deploying new software, why do you deploy? You don't need to deploy a new version to all of your nodes. Why don't you pick one or two nodes and deploy your software there and then verify it in production to make sure it works? If not, you can roll back. So I know you're thinking, well, this doesn't work for everything. So how do you deploy things with state? Like you have a database that you want to upgrade, or you have an application that actually maintains state locally through some kind of file system. Well, this is what I would tell you to do for that. There are things that you can automate all the way, and there's things that you can automate most of the way. This is actually a most of the way. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to look at these applications, and either make sure that you're reducing state to the smallest piece of thing, or you can do things like with our block storage. You can store the state off the server on our block storage device, and if that server goes away or anything else happens, you can move it to another server. So what happens when we fail? We do fail. Well, we have three choices. And the first choice is to roll back. The easiest thing you can do whenever you have a failure to production is you just roll back. The next thing you can do, and this has been championed by Etsy, is that they don't actually roll back ever. What they do is if they have a bad deploy, they actually everyone works at the same time to create a new piece of software with a new release, and they actually just roll forward. A piece of SHA-1 will only see a server one time. So, how can you fail forward? Let's think about this. If uptime is super important, roll back. I'll tell you right now, if you have uptime and you need multiple nines and you have an issue, it might be simplest just to roll back. But I also want you to think about whenever you are deploying that you're not deploying church and state at the same time. And what does that mean? Well, I will call church your actual software, your binaries, your artifacts, and I will call state your data. So, and a good example would be from the Rails world is that people like to deploy their Rails applications and then they deploy their database changes at the same time. Don't do that. Deploy one and then deploy the other. Like I said, separate church, code, and state. And one way you can do this is you can make database changes before you actually deploy the software, and you can use feature flags to hide that code until it's actually suitable for production. So we're going to get into the why we do all this, is that what we are looking for is we are trying to build a continuous deployment pipeline. And really, I like to change these words and say that we are trying to build a continuous delivery pipeline. We want the ability to be able to deliver continuously, all the time, no exceptions. So the previous slides were only just getting you to the level of getting what I really wanted to talk about. So how do we start? So think about this. There's cattle and there's pets. I know a lot of people don't like this analogy, but really what it is that we have a certain set. We have servers that can be cattle, and we have servers that can be pets. The difference is that cattle are servers that we don't give a name. We grow clusters, we shrink clusters, it doesn't matter. Pets are servers that we give names to, and we should not be giving names to servers. But also, something else we should think about is servers versus services. It's 2016, the public cloud is available to everyone in every industry for the most part. I mean, I understand there are certain things in finance and certain things in healthcare people just want to keep close, or other secrets they want to keep close. So let's think about this. Because we are deploying to environments that can grow and shrink with us, what we should think about is servers versus services. We should not think about how many servers we have, we should think about how many instances of services we have. Like I said, deploy services. And remember that servers are an implementation detail. In a few years, we're not going to be thinking about individual servers, even at the cloud provider level. We're not going to say that you need 10 servers for this. We're going to tell you that you have 50 CPU cores at 2 point something gigahertz per second, you have an X amount of memory, and you have Y amount of disk. And that's what we want to think about. So now, I think we're about there. We've thought about all the things that we need to deploy servers to production. And I would like to leave you with a couple of quotes. Remember that this is why tooling like containers and Linux with Docker and things like an operating system level projects like data center level operating systems like Kubernetes and Mesos and Nomad are so important. So, let's see. So I think that's about it. I just wanted to talk about deployments today, and thank you.